Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of the U of Care podcast. My name is Oliver Gruntman, and today I'm very excited to have my uh, co-host or the other host of a U of Care podcast, the U of Care affiliate podcast, Victor Schneider here. I'm really excited to talk to you. You obviously, many of our listeners, of our audience members will know you from the affiliate podcast, but there's a lot more to know about you. And I'm really glad to have you on. So would you mind introducing yourself?
Not at all. Thank you, Oliver, for having me here. My name is Victor Schneider. I'm a fourth year graduate student in clinical and health psychology, working on my doctorate in the lab of Dr. Jeff Boiseno. So I'm here in one of our lab spaces today. It's a little rainy, but I am super excited to talk with you.
Awesome. Well, same here. You mentioned before we started that you got a little bit wet, so
Yeah.
it's probably not a good combination, wet and cold outside.
It's
Yeah,
okay.
but you grew up in Ohio and then Illinois, right? If I understood your background correctly from your CV, so you're probably used to cold and wet on a very frequent basis, more frequently than potentially Florida at this point.
Yes, I would say it's wet today, but not particularly cold. It's still in the 60s. So that's balmy.
Yeah, certainly better than the heat in the summer.
Mhm.
So I read a little bit about your background. Obviously, that's how I usually prepare, and it's interesting to see your very diverse engagement on various levels when it comes to podcasting, which kind of connected us together. You reached out to me, and I was very excited to have somebody who is actually more experienced with podcasting than I am and very dedicated to it. So, do you mind talking a little bit about your enthusiasm for podcasting and in general engaging with the community?
Not at all. So I've been doing podcasting for a few years, even before grad school. I would play Dungeons and Dragons with friends as like a hobby. And one of my friends said, hey, we're having a lot of fun with this. What if we started recording it and, making some background music and really having fun with that? So we started doing that in 2018. Then I started grad school in 2019, and with everything going on in terms of like scientific research and almost like anti-intellectualism, I wanted to try and help a little bit in making sure that research was getting out there, that scientists had a chance to kind of talk and present themselves as human beings with diverse hobbies and interests. So when I came to University of Florida, I spoke with Jeff, Dr. Boiseno, and said, "Hey, this is a skill that I have. This is an interest that I've got. Is there a way to, you know, contribute to participate in this process?" And he mentioned your name. He said, Dr. Grunman has been working on this really cool idea, getting interviews with folks. Let's see if there's space for you with that project. And thankfully, there was. You welcomed me with open arms, and I've been working with you on this podcast for almost 4 years now, which is kind of wild to think of.
Yeah, I think it's outstanding what you have been doing with the affiliate podcast, because it really highlights the diversity of our up and coming future researchers and really highlighting what is actually going on in each of the lab groups. When I interview the faculty, it is more on a broader scale, what are their interests, but you really dig in with the students. So I really, or with these graduate level learners.
Right.
Sometimes I hesitate to refer to them as students, because they are up and coming researchers. That's how I really see it. So it's exciting to see this duality for folks to really dig in. Now, talking about that, your own research has kind of evolved from an area that is, I think that many folks, or maybe the general population, might not be associating with substance use disorders or addiction as much, but it certainly plays a very big role when we talk
Mhm.
about pain and substance use disorders. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's fascinating.
I appreciate that. I agree. So when I finished undergrad from Loyola Chicago, like you said, up in Illinois, I moved back to Cincinnati and I started working with the Pain Research Center at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center with Dr. Chris King, Dr. Robert Coghill, Dr. Hadas Nachman and having the chance as a research coordinator to kind of get on the ground level and make research happen. At that time, I was kind of exploring my own sort of interests. So we'd been working on studies in temporomandibular joint disorder, juvenile fibromyalgia. I was looking at virtual reality. And in the area of pain, virtual reality had been distraction based. Dr. King, encouraged me, and we went out to a conference in California looking at VR applications in intervention. And so there were lots going on with exposure therapy and distraction for particularly like patients who are experiencing burns, recovering in the burn ward, and finding ways to use games or other things to get people moving, to get people active, to get people recovering in these different ways. So we kind of brought that back to Cincinnati Children's, and I helped bring on these projects, working with kids with juvenile fibromyalgia, like PT. So there'd be a headset that we would give them, and it would encourage them to move to like playing dodgeball, right? These are kids who hurt all over, and the movement is helpful, but we need to distract them from the pain that they're experiencing. So looking to see how distraction could help there with VR, going to kids post-op and giving them VR to help distract them from what they were going through. So it was a really cool early exposure to virtual reality. When I was applying for graduate school, I remember the interviews that I had here at UF. Dr. Boiseno, who does substance misuse research, he was talking about his interest in building a physical bar. So in this room that I am currently, he was saying, he'd like to, pay the university X thousands of dollars to try and get a physical bar created so that we could look at drinking behavior, to try and do that bridge between substance misuse, alcohol use, and chronic pain, or other sort of biopsychosocial interactions that could be associated with hazardous drinking. And I said, well, I've got this experience with virtual reality. What if we did, like, almost jokingly, what if we did a virtual bar and worked to, instead of making a physical bar environment, what if we use like VR to create an example of an environment that we could then change and tweak and evolve over time, and change the sound and change what they see and really make it standard without maybe going through tens and tens of thousands of dollars to create a physical space. So that became my master's. It was feasibility. We worked with a local game developer, a local programmer, and created a virtual reality bar environment that we called the Swiss Mountain Pub. And for my master's, we brought folks in. We had them sit in this room. There's a little scale on the table in front of me here. We would have people actually drink. Yangling or Angry Orchard would have a tracker attached, and with the headset on, they would reach out, pick up the beer and drink and sit it down. So we could control the environment, what they see and what they hear. And then with the scale, we could get very fine and immediate responses for how much they're drinking, how frequently, intervals and things like that. And then we gave them a very basic manipulation where we had a virtual bar goer, someone programmed to sit across from him at the bar and just do a very simple drinking animation, just like it wasn't anything special. But we would change the rate of the virtual bar goer between the visits and use that as the condition to see if folks would have a social manipulation even in a virtual space. And so that's published now. That was my master's thesis. We did find feasibility. Folks had a good time. They were in there for an hour, so they got a little bored after a while. Maybe giving them more things to do in there would be good, or reducing the time. But we were seeing the folks, would interact with the virtual drinker. They would talk to them. They would drink, and we got some really good data from that. And then, so the next step is my dissertation, which is comparing the virtual bar that we have and then a physical bar that is elsewhere on campus, actually beneath the stadium here. So for my dissertation, I go back and forth and run folks in the virtual bar and the physical bar to see if there are differences in how people drink. Because if it's the same, then we can see what data we're getting from both environments, and kind of opens up some opportunities with future assessment and intervention.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So this is exciting. I think virtual reality is kind of branching out in these different directions when we see what Meta is doing with virtual reality and more of a social interaction construct versus applying it to a scientific research setting where we and then now correlating it via kind of a validation procedure, right? How well can we translate what we see in a physical bar setting to something like virtual reality, and then really playing around with these parameters? That's absolutely fascinating. So obviously this can be applied to many other settings then as well, right? If you think about it. But going back to your background in pain research and virtual reality, when we think about children or adolescents, sometimes they might not be able to express themselves and how their pain comes about. Now, you obviously were working more on the physical therapy side, but do you think that pain research in that regard can sometimes be related to what can translate into addiction research when it comes to expressing or not being able to express feelings, emotions, or the physical state of addiction versus the physical state of pain perception? Do you see overlap there that maybe is something that we still need to address?
In terms of using virtual reality to help folks express pain or to help folks express stress associated with their substance use?
Yes.
Yeah, I think there are some opportunities there. We have different controllers, different trackers that folks can have in their hand in the environment that they can use to interact with the world. So currently we give them visual analog scales that pop up really, really big in front of their face. They can't miss it. And periodically while they're in the bar, and they can use the slider just with their hand to assess. So there are different ways to integrate that into the virtual environment. I think there's more work to be done in terms of unlocking those potentials for VR and how people express and report distress from what they're experiencing. But yeah, I think there's potential there.
When you say that you had a social interaction, a virtual social interaction, can you explain a little bit more how this reflected or influenced drinking behavior of the individual when there was somebody else who was kind of drinking with them, right?
Yeah, let me pull up the paper so I represent this right. Okay. Yeah, so I've just pulled up the abstract real quick, but we wrote multi-level models indicated participants had greater sip volumes and lower sip intervals when the Confederate drank quickly. So when in those two conditions, we had that drinking animation playing for the fast condition every 30 to 60 seconds, and then for the slow condition every 60 to 120 seconds. So kind of double the rate. And what we found generally was that in the fast condition, folks had a reduced sip interval, so they drank more quickly, and greater sip volume, so they were drinking more each time. So I know it's been a year or so since I worked with this data, but it was kind of neat to see it. The data reflected sort of the experience that we had, because I would watch. It was through COVID that we were running this, so I was watching through this camera from another room, and folks would be in the virtual bar just with a gender matched virtual drinker, and they would talk to the virtual drinker. Like we had participants who, when the virtual drinker played that animation, they would take their own drink and like cheers and like go toe to toe. So it was kind of cool to see that folks, made that social connection with someone who was giving very little input into that relationship, to the point where we could see that reflected in the data, that their drinking was changing based on the rate that the virtual drinker was imbibing.
When we think about, and you said an interesting thing there, a sex or gender matched drinking buddy. I don't know if you have looked into this at all in a virtual versus real world setting. Is there a difference if the other person you're drinking with is of a different sex? So if a man drinks with a woman versus woman with a man and stuff like that.
That's something that'd be really cool to look at in the future.
Yeah.
What we would love, a future function we would like to have is like like The Sims, or avatar building, right? Like for a video game, you kind of make your character, having a character designer available, so you can change gender, race, ethnicity, age, BMI, perceived socioeconomic class, all these different qualities of the folks, in the bar, not just maybe one drinker, but a group of drinkers, and not just a bar, but maybe an apartment or a penthouse or a dive, to really explore the environment and these social manipulations to see what factors are more likely to impact hazardous drinking behavior in population X, population Y, population Z, and really dive into understanding. So I'm looking at the ecological validity of VR to explore these areas. But once we understand that a bit better, the sky's the limit.
Yeah, it's fascinating, the possibilities. Now, these were all kind of social drinkers and not somebody with an alcohol use disorder, right?
That is correct.
Okay,
yeah.
So obviously that's a potential variable that might quite substantially impact how folks engage.
My dissertation is using hazardous drinkers, folks who are drinking at a more riskier level.
Okay, but not necessarily those who have been diagnosed with an alcohol use disorder. Or
that is correct.
Okay,
that's the direction that we're heading.
Okay, yeah. One would probably. So what is your hypothesis when you think about virtual reality versus real bar setting, and how the two will compare when you talk about wanting to validate it or provide an as close match to the two? What do you think is gonna play out, or what are you seeing currently?
So I haven't looked at the data for the dissertation yet. It's still a little early in that process, but what I hypothesize is that folks drink consistently in the two environments. We've modeled a new virtual bar. So we used the one bar for the masters. We went back to the programmer and kind of made the next level. We made the bar to look like the physical bar that we're using for this study. So I went over, it's the Edge Lab here. It's been run by Dr. Lieben. He's moving to a different program, but he's the one I've been working with the most in terms of the Edge bar. Went over there, took like 200 pictures, got the blueprints, sent them to the programmer, and he and his team designed like a physical, that physical bar in VR. And it looks shockingly similar, like even with like the light particle effects. There's a neon sign in the physical bar that they've got looking really cool in VR. So the hope is controlling for as much as we can the physical appearance, the environment, the auditory, like we have music playing, the same in both places, that folks will drink the same. So that's our hypothesis. The other piece of this study is we do a subtle manipulation. If you want to participate in this study, you probably should have stopped listening a while ago, because we've explained stuff. But like, here's the other condition we're doing. So folks drink. They have 2 drinking bouts in both environments, so VR and the physical bar. Before and after each drinking bout, we're giving them some psychomotor tasks adapted from the WAIS-4. on one visit, we just have them do it. We don't tell them anymore. On the other visit, we say, okay, we're going to do these tests again at the end. And when we do, we're going to look to see if you perform more poorly than you did at the start. And if you do, we're going to have a reduction in payment. To avoid that reduction in payment, we recommend you don't drink more than X amount.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's
So,
interesting.
so it's a disincentive paradigm that we're doing in both environments. And then we just want to see how people react. We want to
Mm.
see if people react to these conditions the same in both environment as well. So that's another aim that we have. Not just do they drink the same, do they respond the same?
Well, it's interesting if you, I assume when you don't tell them that there's a disincentive or anything like that, that you don't, when you measure them according to the ways for, that you do not tell them the outcome, right? You do not tell them
That's
if
correct.
they impaired or anything.
That's
So they
correct.
wouldn't even know if the amount and frequency at which they drink would lead to impairment or not.
Yeah, we are counterbalancing all of it. So it's going to change person to person what order they experience these in. We're doing a really abridged version. We're doing symbol substitution and the grooved pegboard. So those are pretty straightforward enough tasks that they kind of self score. They know, like, oof, I didn't do that. I did worse than last time, or oh, I did pretty good. But from my perspective, it doesn't even matter if they worry that they're going to do more poorly. I want them. It doesn't matter if they do more poorly. I want them to be aware that they might. Right? Like it's kind of displaced. Like
Yeah.
if they drink too much, they may do more poorly, and that may lead to a reduction in payment. So I want them to go through that kind of thought process of, how do they judge, is having an extra beer worth it, or do they want to play it safe and make sure they get the full amount? And I just want to say at the end of the study, everyone gets the full amount regardless.
Okay.
So we're just, if we withhold money, it's like, oh, well, for a week, and then we give you what we withheld. So everyone gets paid the same at the end.
Okay, yeah. Well, it's fascinating. So before we finish, and I appreciate you taking the time today, your passion for Dungeons and Dragons, I share that. I share
I
that.
didn't know that. Wonderful.
Although I don't get to play as often any longer
Mhm.
because, work and everything, and
Mhm.
finding the right crowd to play with. This is, I would consider Dungeons and Dragons, which was once vilified and, being of satanic origins or anything like that, whatever. These days, luckily, we're a little bit more open to it. I see that also as a potentially distracting intervention when it comes to not only substance use disorders or pain, but also for other many other conditions when you think about depression, anxiety, and the like, because it is a socialized environment. It allows you to step outside your own constraints and be somebody potentially idolized or vilified, right, depending on who you play, but also as a therapeutic option. Do you think that something like that can provide an actual therapy similar to virtual reality?
I think Dungeons and Dragons has incredible potential in psychology. As a player, you are putting yourself in someone else's shoes. You are kind of role playing, which leads to opportunities for team building, problem solving, executive skills that are always helpful and vital. But you also get to experience the story. And I think as a DM, which I tend to be, it's a great way for me to develop my own, as a clinical psychologist, my own sort of therapy and rapport building. It's following a narrative, it's meeting characters where they're at, and helping the players experience these emotions in a safe and comfortable environment. I've been doing that a lot over the last pandemic to keep myself sane while in my apartment. So it's been a really cool opportunity and experience to not just continue working on podcasting, which I am passionate about and glad to be connecting to my career, but also it's a good way to connect with friends and also work on these other skills. So I think VR, there's potential there. I think video games are beginning to explore some of that potential, but there's so much to do and so much to see when it comes to what this kind of technology has in store for narrative storytelling, therapy, and all sorts of things. So we're just at the beginning of this. I think that is an area where the tech companies have it right.
Yeah. Well, for those who are not familiar with D&D terminology, DM is the dungeon master who leads the game.
Yes.
Just wanted to point that out.
Yes.
So yeah, I think it's a tool, right? But we still need to remember that we as humans need to be present for it. We are the ones that actually have to control what is going on and how it is designed. So I think that is something that sometimes we might not be aware of as much when we subconsciously go into the intertubes, the internet, and that there is human control and needs to be well designed. Okay, well, Victor, any last words or any last words of wisdom or anything you would like to share with our audience?
Oh my goodness, I've asked so many people that same question, and I haven't actually thought what mine would be. Do what you like, do what you enjoy. Try and follow those opportunities. Meet people, talk with them. Surround yourself with people who are definitely smarter than you, and see what they have to say and think about things. So I don't know. That'll probably change over time as going through my own experiences to think about what I've learned. But yeah, do what you like.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, because you're going to do it for a long time and many hours. And if you're not passionate about it, it can be a rather wrecking experience. I completely agree. Well,
and if folks out there are looking for a good Dungeons and Dragons podcast, check out my website, victorschneider.com. You can find links to everything there.
That's awesome. Yeah, I actually have yet to listen to a podcast, but I will definitely do this because you are passionate about it, and I really enjoy the way that you approach things. Victor, thank you so much for taking time today. It was really awesome to talk with you, and I obviously wish you the best. I can't wait to see what else is coming out of your research. I find it fascinating, the whole virtual reality and its many applications in research. So thank you for sharing your knowledge and what you're doing with us today.
Thank you for the time, Oliver. I appreciate you inviting me on. I had a really good time talking with you, and look forward to more conversations in the future.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for listening to today's podcast, and watch out for the next podcast that will be published. Take care, you all.
Bye, everyone.